He handed her the envelope on a Tuesday morning, right after she'd made his coffee the way he liked it. 2 sugars, a splash of oat milk, stirred not shaken, and she stood there holding it for a long moment before she understood what it was. Divorce papers. Corinne Aldridge had been married to Spencer Aldridge for 11 years. She had followed him from Boston to Chicago when his company needed him there. She had put her own architecture license on hold, just temporarily, he'd said, just until we get settled. And she had renovated their Lincoln Park townhouse with her own hands, learned which contractors he trusted and which ones cut corners, hosted 40-person dinners for his clients every quarter, and built a life around a man who, it turned out, had been building a different one behind her back. That surprised her. She just set the envelope on the kitchen counter next to his coffee, picked up her keys, and walked out. She sat in her car in the parking garage for 45 minutes before she started shaking. Spencer hadn't even said anything, no explanation, no apology, no moment of eye contact that might have given her something to hold on to. He'd just left the envelope where she would find it, like a bill she needed to pay. The woman's name was Addison. Corinne had found out 3 months earlier, by accident, when she'd grabbed Spencer's phone to check the weather and seen a message that wasn't meant for her eyes. She had confronted him that night. He had denied it, then admitted it, then said it didn't mean anything, then said she'd been emotionally unavailable since the miscarriage, and Corinne had gone very quiet because that was the kind of sentence that required silence to fully absorb. She had tried. She would want the record to show that. She had suggested counseling, twice. She had given him space when he said he needed it. She had willed herself to believe that marriages went through hard seasons and came out the other side. But the envelope on the Tuesday morning made clear that Spencer had already decided the other side wasn't something he wanted her in. She signed the papers 6 weeks later. Her hand didn't shake. She'd practiced not letting it. Her attorney, a calm, no-nonsense woman named Patricia Ossie, had walked her through every page. The asset division was straightforward enough. The townhouse would be sold, proceeds split. Spencer kept his company shares. Corinne kept her savings, modest but hers. There was one section near the end, a standard professional indemnity clause about prior joint ventures, that Patricia flagged as slightly unusual wording. But Spencer's attorney assured them it was boilerplate, and Corinne was exhausted, and she signed. She moved into a furnished studio in Wicker Park. It smelled like someone else's candles and had radiators that clanged at 3 in the morning. She lay in bed listening to them for weeks, staring at the ceiling, trying to remember who she was before she was someone's wife. She was 38. Her architecture license had lapsed. She had a degree from Cornell, 7 years of industry experience she'd set aside, and a talent for seeing structural problems that other people missed. She also had a very specific kind of grief that had no clean name, not quite heartbreak, not quite failure, somewhere in between. Her sister Wren called every other day. Her college friend, a woman named Jules who lived in Denver now, sent voice memos that were more like dispatches from the world of the living. Corinne listened to them on the walks she started taking along the lakefront, long ones, sometimes 2 hours, because moving her body was the only thing that made her brain quiet. It was on one of those walks, 6 weeks after she'd signed the papers, that she ran into Fletcher Malone. She literally ran into him. She was coming around a bend near the chess pavilion, with her earbuds in, not paying attention, and she collided with a man who was standing still reading something on his phone, and his coffee went sideways, and she grabbed his arm to keep him from stumbling, and he grabbed hers, and they both stood there for a second, with their arms around each other, like the beginning of a dance. "I'm so sorry," Corinne said. "Don't be," he said. "I should have been watching where I was standing." He had a way of saying things that made the other person feel less embarrassed. She noticed that later, in retrospect. He also had a very good suit, and a coffee stain spreading across the lapel, which she immediately offered to pay for, and he laughed. "It's fine," he said. "I've got a meeting in an hour and 3 other suits. This one gets a day off." His name was Fletcher Malone. He was the kind of man who remembered your name after one introduction and looked you in the eye when he spoke to you. He asked what she did. She said she was between things. He nodded like that was a perfectly complete answer, and they ended up sitting on a bench for 20 minutes while his second coffee cooled in his hand, talking about Chicago architecture, of all things, because she'd made a comment about the pavilion's mid-century bones, and he'd said he didn't know anything about that. But he wanted to. He was, as she would learn, the co-founder of Malone Vance Capital, a private equity firm that had recently acquired a development portfolio worth north of $400 million. He did not lead with this information. She found it out later, through a search she felt slightly embarrassed to have done. He gave her his card when they parted ways. He said if she was ever interested in consulting work, his firm had just absorbed a real estate development arm, and the head of that division had complained that none of their current architects had an eye for structural assessment. He said it casually, like he mentioned it to strangers on park benches regularly. She tucked the card in her jacket pocket and told herself she probably wouldn't call. She called 3 weeks later. The consulting work started small, a site assessment on a warehouse conversion in Pilsen that his firm was considering. She went through the building with a flashlight and a clipboard, and her old instincts, which had apparently not rusted away during the 11 years she'd spent using them on Spencer's benefit dinners and dining room renovations. She wrote her assessment in a night. Fletcher read it in a morning and called to say it was the most useful document he'd received in 2 years. "You found the load-bearing issue on the northeast wall," he said. "The renovation company would have caught it eventually," she said, after they'd already poured money into the wrong approach. She started a limited LLC, Aldridge Structural Consulting. It was just her and a part-time assistant named Bo who handled scheduling and invoices and had strong opinions about fonts. It was also, for the first time in over a decade, entirely hers. Meanwhile, Spencer was getting married again. She found out from Wren, who had found out from someone in their old social circle who had seen an announcement. The wedding was planned for early spring. Addison, apparently, had been introduced to Spencer's mother. Corinne absorbed this information in her car outside a hardware store and sat with it for the length of one full Taylor Swift album, which she chose deliberately for this exact kind of occasion. And then she went inside and bought the tile grout she needed for her bathroom renovation, and did not think about Spencer Aldridge for the rest of the afternoon. She was realizing, angrier than she had admitted to herself. Not the hot kind of anger, the slow, low kind that settles in your chest and stays there. She had given 11 years to a man and a life, and she had not even been granted the courtesy of an honest conversation about why it ended. She had been handed an envelope. She started running instead of just walking. 3 miles, then 5, then 8. Her body stopped feeling fragile. Fletcher sent work her way consistently. More assessments, then a full project oversight role on a mixed-use development on the North Shore. She flew to Charlotte for a site visit. She flew to Nashville. She started sleeping through the night again. At some point, without her having fully registered when, Fletcher stopped being just a client. He texted outside of work hours. Nothing forward, nothing that could be called anything other than friendly. A news article about brutalist architecture that he thought she'd find funny. A question about a book she'd mentioned once. 3 weeks later, out of nowhere, she responded. He responded. It became something she noticed she was looking forward to. She told Jules about him on a voice memo, keeping her voice carefully even, and Jules sent back 14 seconds of a single sustained scream, followed by the words, "Okay, continue." She told herself it wasn't like that. She told herself this frequently. It was, of course, exactly like that. The thing that complicated everything came not from her heart, but from her attorney. Patricia Osei called on a Thursday afternoon in early November, 8 months after the divorce had been finalized. She said she needed Corinne to come in. Her voice had a particular quality to it. Not alarmed exactly, but careful, the way you are when you want someone to be seated before you tell them something. Corinne sat across from Patricia's desk the next morning and listened. The clause. The one near the end of the divorce agreement that Patricia had flagged as unusual wording, Spencer's attorney had called it boilerplate. It was not boilerplate. It was, in fact, a transfer of rights, a waiver of any claim Corinne might have to a specific category of intellectual property developed jointly during the marriage, including architectural designs and structural methodologies created using shared resources. What it meant in plain language was this. The structural assessment methodology that Corinne had been refining for 12 years, The systematic approach she developed for identifying hidden load-bearing failures in older buildings. The same approach she'd written into every report since restarting her career. Spencer's attorneys were now claiming that methodology was covered by the clause, that it belonged, in part, to him, that she had unknowingly signed it away. She sat very still. "He did this on purpose," she said. "I can't say that," Patricia said carefully. "What I can say is that the language was not standard, and his attorney knew that, and someone made a decision not to flag it clearly." "Addison works in intellectual property law," Corinne said. The pieces arranged themselves in her mind with a cold, quiet precision. "She does corporate IP. That's how they met." Spencer's company had brought her firm in for a consultation. Patricia was quiet for a moment. "That's useful context. He married the person who helped him do this to me." She went home and sat at her kitchen table for a long time. The radiators clanged. She didn't hear them. The part that made her want to put her fist through the wall, not the loss exactly, but the calculation of it. The fact that he had not simply left. He had planned it. He had brought in someone with the specific expertise to insert language into a divorce agreement that Corinne, exhausted and grieving and trusting her own attorney to catch these things, would sign without fully understanding. He had weaponized her lowest moment. She called Patricia back. She said she wanted to fight it. Patricia said she'd need to be prepared for it to be expensive and difficult and possibly public. Corinne said she was aware. She did not call Fletcher that night. She sat with it alone. She went to bed early and lay there in the dark, thinking about the 11 years and the miscarriage and the envelope on the counter and the coffee she'd made him the way he liked it. And she felt something harden in her chest, like a structural beam settling into place. Not bitterness. Something cleaner than that, a kind of resolve. He had thought she would be too worn down to come back from this. He had miscalculated. The litigation began in January. Fletcher found out when a journalist called his office. A business reporter who had heard the case involved Malone Vance Capital's consulting contracts. And Fletcher called Corinne directly, not to pressure her, but to say that his firm's legal team was available to provide supporting documentation about the independent nature of her methodology, if that would help. He said it the same way he'd said everything else, like it was simply the obvious next move. "You don't have to do that," she said. "I know," he said. She let him. Spencer's attorneys sent 2 letters in February. The first argued that Corinne had used shared financial resources during the marriage to develop her professional tools. The second threatened to escalate to a broader claim involving revenues she'd earned in the 8 months since restarting. Patricia called the second letter aggressive and somewhat desperate, which Corinne took as good news. In March, Spencer's company began to unravel. It started with an audit, a routine one, initiated by a new board member who'd come in through a recent acquisition. What the audit found was a pattern of expense misclassifications going back 4 years. Nothing so crude as outright theft, but a systematic inflation of operational costs in a way that had artificially boosted the firm's valuation at a critical fundraising moment. The kind of thing that, once found, tends to expand in scope with every additional day of looking. Corinne had not orchestrated this. She wanted the record to be clear on that. She had not called any board members, had not whispered anything to anyone. She had been focused entirely on her own case. But she did know, because she'd lived in that world for 11 years, that Spencer had been managing his numbers aggressively. She had noticed things. Not understood them fully at the time, but noticed them. The way he'd restructured certain expenses right before investor calls. The conversations he'd stopped having when she walked into rooms. She hadn't known what she was seeing. She knew now. The audit findings went to the SEC in April. By then, Spencer's counsel had quietly settled most of Corinne's IP claim. The settlement was confidential, but it restored her full rights to her methodology and included a provision she'd specifically requested. A public correction in the industry journal that had published a brief piece about the dispute, clarifying that the methodology in question was solely and originally hers. She read the correction the morning it went live, sitting in her office above Pilsen with her coffee, watching the light come through the south-facing windows she'd insisted on when she'd signed the lease. Fletcher texted around noon. He sent a single line, "Told you." She laughed out loud at her desk, which startled Beau so badly he spilled his own coffee. Spencer's wedding had been postponed when the audit findings became public. Corinne heard this from Ren and said nothing. Whatever Spencer was going through now, she found she did not want to think about it. Not out of magnanimity, she was honest with herself about that, but because it simply no longer occupied the same space in her. She had moved into different rooms. Her firm picked up 3 new contracts that spring. The North Shore development won a regional design award. An architecture blog she'd never heard of ran a profile on her structural assessment work and called her approach quietly revolutionary, which she found both flattering and accurate. She and Fletcher had dinner in May. It was technically a business dinner. They told themselves this, but it ran 4 hours and neither of them looked at a contract once. He talked about his mother, who had built a small catering business from nothing, and taught him that sustainability mattered more than scale. Corinne talked about the year in college she'd spent drafting buildings by hand, before CAD had fully taken over, and the professor who had told her she had an unusual instinct for structure. Fletcher listened the way people do when they actually want to hear what you're saying. Walking back to her car afterward, the May evening warm and easy around them, Fletcher touched her elbow to steer her around a raised sidewalk seam she hadn't seen. She would think about that later, the lightness of it. Not a performance, not a gesture, just someone looking out for her without making a production of it. She had been looked at all her life as someone who needed to be managed. Spencer had managed her, her career, her time, her ambitions, the particular way she held her opinions. Fletcher looked at her like she was someone worth watching, which was different. She hadn't understood the difference until she felt it. In June, her LLC converted to a full corporation, Aldridge Structural. She hired 2 junior associates and moved into a larger space in the same building, 2nd floor, better light. In July, Spencer's SEC matter moved to formal investigation. His attorney released a statement. Addison's firm severed ties with him, citing conflicts of interest. Corinne read about this in a brief blurb in the business section of the Tribune, over breakfast, and moved on to the crossword. On a Thursday in late August, Fletcher asked if she wanted to take a week off. He said he'd been looking at a place on Lake Superior, North Shore, very quiet. He said he understood entirely if she wanted to go alone, or not at all, or if this was too much to say without having properly said the things that came before it. "You're nervous," she said. "Mildly," he said, "in a way I find unusual." She looked at him for a moment. 11 years of someone who had never once seemed uncertain about her. A man who'd handed her an envelope and moved on, and across the table, this person who could somehow be both the most composed person in any room and quietly nervous about asking a question. "I'll go," she said. She said it the way she'd signed her firm's first contract, like something that had been decided long before the moment arrived. She didn't think about Spencer on that trip. She thought about the way the light moved on the lake at 6 in the morning, and the argument she and Fletcher had about whether the 1972 EPA rules had saved or stifled mid-century industrial architecture, and the dinner he made on the second night that was technically not good, but made with an effort she recognized as sincere. She thought about sitting on the porch the last evening, the air already carrying the first edge of fall, and feeling like a person who had come back from somewhere long and hard and arrived, finally, somewhere worth being. She had signed the papers on a Tuesday morning and not cried until she reached her car. She had sat in that parking garage and shaken and not known what her life was anymore, or who she was inside it. She had built a business with the hands, and the instincts she'd almost let someone convince her were not particularly valuable. And the man who had calculated her lowest point as the moment to take something from her had found, in the end, that he'd only cleared the space for what was already hers.